We take up the story halfway through chapter 11, at the point at which Pip has just finished his second visit to Miss Havisham. A day was appointed for my return, and I was taken down into the yard to be fed in the former dog-like manner. There too I was again left to wander about as I liked. It is not much to the purpose whether a gate in that garden wall which I had scrambled up to peep over on the last occasion was, on that last occasion, open or shut. Enough that I saw no gate then, and I saw one now. As it stood open, and as I knew that Estella had let our visitors out, for she had returned with the keys in her hand, I strolled into the garden and strolled all over it. It was quite a wilderness, and there were old melon frames and cucumber frames in it which seemed in their decline to have produced a spontaneous growth of weak attempts at pieces of old hats and boots, and now and then a weedy offshoot into the likeness of a battered saucepan. When I had exhausted the garden and a greenhouse with nothing in it but a fallen-down grapevine and some bottles, I found myself in the dismal corner upon which I had looked out of the window. Never questioning for a moment that the house was now empty, I looked in at another window and found myself, to my great surprise, exchanging a broad stare with a pale young gentleman with red eyelids and light hair. This pale young gentleman quickly disappeared and reappeared beside me. He had been at his books when I had found myself staring at him, and now I saw that he was inky. "Hello," he said, "young fellow." Hello being a general observation which I had usually observed to be best answered by itself, I said, "Hello," politely omitting young fellow. "Who let you in?" said he. "Miss Estella." "Who gave you leave to prowl about?" "Miss Estella." "Come and fight," said the pale young gentleman. What could I do but follow him? I have often asked myself the question since, but what could I do? His manner was so final, and I was so astonished, that I followed where he led, as if I had been under a spell. "Stop a moment, though," he said, wheeling round before we'd gone many paces. "I ought to give you a reason for fighting, too. There it is." In a most irritating manner, he instantly slapped his hands against one another, daintily flung one of his legs up behind him, pulled my hair, slapped his hands again, dipped his head, and butted it into my stomach. The bull-like proceeding last mentioned, besides that it was unquestionably to be regarded in the light of a liberty, was particularly disagreeable just after the bread and meat. I therefore hit out at him, and was going to hit out again when he said, "Aha! Would you?" and he began dancing backwards and forwards in a manner quite unparalleled within my limited experience. "Laws of the game," said he. Here he skipped from his left leg to his right. "Regular rules." Here he skipped from his right leg to his left. "Come to the ground and go through the preliminaries." Here he dodged backwards and forwards and did all sorts of things while I looked helplessly at him. I was secretly afraid of him when I saw him so dexterous, for I felt morally and physically convinced that his light head of hair could have no business in the pit of my stomach, and that I had a right to consider it irrelevant when so obtruded on my attention. Therefore, I followed him without a word to a retired nook of the garden, formed by the junction of two walls and screened by some rubbish. On his asking me if I was satisfied with the ground, and on my replying yes, He begged my leave to absent himself for a moment and quickly returned with a bottle of water and a sponge tipped in vinegar. "Available for both," he said, placing these against the wall, and then fell to pulling off not only his jacket and waistcoat, but his shirt too, in a manner at once light-hearted, businesslike, and bloodthirsty. Although he didn't look very healthy, having pimples on his face and a breaking out at his mouth, these dreadful preparations quite appalled me. I judged him to be about my age, but he was much taller, and he had a way of spinning himself about, as was full of experience. For the rest, he was a young gentleman in a grey suit, when not denuded for battle, with his elbows, knees, wrists, and heels considerably in advance of the rest of him as to development. My heart failed me when I saw him squaring at me with every demonstration of mechanical nicety, and eyeing my anatomy as if he were minutely choosing his bone. I never have been so surprised in my life as I was when I let out the first blow and saw him lying on his back looking up at me with a bloody nose and his face exceedingly foreshortened. But he was on his feet directly, and after sponging himself with a great show of dexterity, began squaring again. The second greatest surprise I have ever had in my life was seeing him on his back again, looking up at me out of a black eye. His spirit inspired me with great respect. He seemed to have no strength, and he never once hit hard, but he was always knocked down. He would wake up again in a moment, sponging himself, drinking out of the water bottle, and with great satisfaction of seconding himself to form, coming at me with an air and a show that made me he was really going to do for me at last. He got heavily bruised, for I am sorry to record that the more I hit him, the harder I hit him. But he came up again and again and again, until at last he had a bad fall with the back of his head against the wall. Even after that crisis in our affairs, he got up and turned round and round confusedly for some time, not knowing where I was, but finally went on his knees to his sponge and threw it up in the air, at the same time panting out, "That means you've won!" He seemed so brave and innocent that although I had not proposed the contest, I felt but a gloomy satisfaction in my victory. Indeed, I go so far as to hope that I regarded myself, while dressing, as a species of savage young wolf or other wild beast. However, I got dressed, darkly wiping my sanguinary face at intervals, and I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "No, thank you." And I said, "Good afternoon," and he said, "Same to you." When I got out into the courtyard, I found Estella waiting with the keys, but she neither asked me where I had been or why I had kept her waiting, and there was a bright flush upon her face as though something had happened to delight her. Instead of going straight to the gate too, she stepped back into the passage and beckoned me. "Come here. You may kiss me, if you like." I kissed her cheek as she turned it to me. I think I would have gone through a great deal to kiss her cheek, but I felt that that kiss was given to the coarse, common boy, as a piece of money might have been, and that it was worth nothing. What with the birthday visitors, and what with the cards, and what with the fight, my stay had lasted so long that when I needed home, the light on the spit of the sand off the point on the marshes was gleaming against the black night sky, and Joe's furnace was flinging a path of fire across the road. Chapter 12. My mind grew very uneasy on the subject of the pale young gentleman. The more I thought of the fight and recalled the pale young gentleman on his back in various stages of puffy and encrimsoned countenance, the more certain it appeared that something would be done to me. I felt that the pale young gentleman's blood was on my head, and that the law would avenge it. Without having any definite idea of the penalties I had incurred, it was clear to me that village boys couldn't go stalking about the country, ravaging the houses of gentlefolks and pitching into their studious youth without laying themselves open to severe punishment. For some days I even kept myself at home and looked out of the window with the greatest caution and trepidation before going out on any errand, lest the officers of the county jail should pounce upon me. The pale young gentleman's nose had stained my trousers, and I wished to wash out that evidence of my guilt in the dead of night. I had cut my knuckles against the pale young gentleman's teeth, and I twisted my imaginations into 1,000 tangles as I devised incredible ways of accounting for that damnatory circumstance when I should be hauled before the judges. When the day came round for my return to the scene of the deed of violence, my terrors reached their height. Whether mirrormans of justice, specially sent down from London, would be lying in ambush behind the gate, whether Miss Havisham, preferring to take her personal revenge for the outrage done to her house, might rise in those grave clothes of hers, draw a pistol, and shoot me dead, whether suborned boys, a numerous band of mercenaries, might be engaged to fall upon me in the Drury and cuff me until I was no more. It was high testimony to my confidence in the spirit of the pale young gentleman that I never imagined him as accessory to their retaliations. They always came to my mind as the acts of injudicious relations of his, goaded out by the state of his visage, and an indignant sympathy with the family features. However, go to Miss Havisham's I must, and go I did. And behold, nothing came of the late struggle. It was not alluded to in any way. No pale young gentleman was to be discovered on the premises. I found the same gate open, and I explored the garden and even looked in at the windows of the detached house. But my view was suddenly stopped by the closed shutters within, and all was lifeless. Only in the corner where the combat had taken place could I detect any evidence of the young gentleman's existence. There were the traces of his blood on the spot, and I covered them with garden mould from the eye of man. On the broad landing between Miss Havisham's own room and the other room in which the long table was laid out, I saw a garden chair, a light chair on wheels that you pushed from behind. It had been placed there since my last visit, and I entered that same day on a regular occupation of pushing Miss Havisham in this chair, when she was tired of walking with her hand upon my shoulder, round her room and across the landing and round the other room. Over and over again we would make these journeys, and sometimes they would last as long as 3 hours at a stretch. I insensibly fell into the general motion of these journeys as numerous, because it was at once satisfied that I should return every alternate day at noon to these premises, and because it was now growing to sum up the period of at least 8 or 10 months. As we began to be more used to one another, Miss Havisham talked more to me and asked me such questions as to which I had learnt, and what I was going to do. I told her I was going to be apprenticed to Joe, I believed, and I engaged upon my knowing nothing and wanting to know everything in the hope that she might offer some help towards that desirable end. But she did not. On the contrary, she preferred my being ignorant. Neither did she give me any money, nor anything save my dinner, nor ever stipulated that I should be paid for my services. Estella was always about and always let me in and out, but never told me I may kiss her again. Sometimes she would coldly tolerate me. Sometimes she would condescend to me. Sometimes she would be quite familiar with me. Sometimes she would tell me energetically that she hated me. Miss Havisham would often ask in a whisper when we were alone, "Does she grow prettier and prettier, Pip?" And when I said yes, for indeed she did, she seemed to enjoy it greedily. Also, when we played cards, Miss Havisham would look on with a miserly relish of Estella's moods, whatever they were, and sometimes when her moods were so many and so contradictory of one another that I was puzzled as to know what to do or say, Miss Havisham would embrace her with lavish fondness, murmuring something in her ear that sounded like, "Break their hearts, my pride and hope, break their hearts and have no mercy." There was a song Joe used to hum fragments of at the forge, of which the burden was old Clem. St. Clement was the patron saint of smiths. This was not a very ceremonious way of rendering homage to a patron saint, but I believe that's how old Clem stood in relation to smiths. It was a song that imitated the measure of beating upon iron, and was a mere lyrical excuse for the introduction of old Clem's respected name. Thus you were to "Hammer boys round old Clem, with a thump and a sound, old Clem, beat it out, old Clem, with a clink for the stout, old Clem, blow the fire, old Clem, roaring try, higher, old Clem." One day, soon after the appearance of the chair, Miss Havisham suddenly saying to me with an impatient movement of her fingers, "There, sing!" I was surprised into crooning this ditty as I pushed her over the floor, and it happened to catch her fancy that she took it up in a low, brooding voice herself, as if she was singing herself to sleep. After that it became customary with us to have it sung as we moved about, and Estella would often join in, though the whole strain was so subdued, in contrast to Joe's, that even when there were three of us, it made less noise in the grim old house than the lightest breath of wind. What could I become with these surroundings? How could my character fail to be influenced by them? Is it to be wondered at if my thoughts were dazed, as my eyes were when I came out into the natural light from this misty yellow room? Perhaps I might have told Joe about the pale young gentleman if I hadn't previously been betrayed into those enormous inventions which I had confessed. Under the circumstances, I felt that Joe could hardly fail to discern in the pale young gentleman an appropriate passenger to be put into the black velvet coach. Therefore I said nothing of him. Besides, shrinking from having Miss Havisham and Estella discussed, which came upon me in the beginning, grew much more potent as the time went on. I did not want to discuss them at all. I reposed complete confidence in no one except Biddy. But I told poor Biddy everything. Why it came natural for me to do so, and why Biddy had a deep concern in everything I told her, I did not know, though I think I know now. Meanwhile, councils went on in the kitchen at home, fraught with almost insupportable aggravation for my exasperated spirit. That ass Pumblechook used often to come over at night for the purpose of discussing my prospects with my sister, And I really do believe, to this hour with less penitence than I ought to feel, that if these hands could have taken a linchpin out of his chaise cart, they would have done it. The miserable man was a man of that confined stolidity of mind that he couldn't discuss my prospects without having me before him, as it were, to operate upon. And he would drag me up from my stool, usually by the collar, where I was quiet in a corner, and putting me before the fire as if I were going to be cooked, he would begin by saying, "Now, mum, here is this boy which you brought up by hand. Hold your head up, boy, and be forever grateful upon them which did so. Now, mum, with respections to this boy," and then he would rumple my hair the wrong way, which from my earliest remembrance, as I have already hinted, I have in my soul denied the right of any fellow creature to do so. And he would hold me before him by the sleeve, a spectacle of imbecility only to be equalled by himself. Then he and my sister would pair off in such nonsensical speculations about Miss Havisham and about what she would do with me and for me that I used to want, quite painfully, to burst into spiteful tears, fly at Pumblechook and pummel him all over. In these dialogues my sister spoke to me as if she were normally wrenching one of my teeth out with every reference, while Pumblechook himself, self-constituted my patron, would sit supervising me with a deprecatory eye, like an architect of my fortunes who thought himself engaged in a very unremunerative job. In these discussions, Joe bore no part, but he was often talked at while they were in progress by means of Mrs. Joe perceiving that he was not favourable to my being taken from the forge. I was fully old enough now to be apprenticed to Joe, and when Joe sat with the poker on his knees, thoughtfully raking out the ashes between the lower bars, my sister would so distinctly construe that innocent action into opposition on his part, that she would dive at him, take the poker out of his hands, shake him, and put it away. There was also a most irritating end to every one of these debates. All in a moment, with nothing to lead up to it, my sister would stop herself in a yawn, and catching sight of me as if it were incidentally, she would swoop upon me with, "Come here, we've had enough of you. You get along to bed. You've caused trouble enough for one night, I hope." As if I besought them as a favour to bother my life out. We went on in this way for a long time, and it seemed likely that we should continue to go along in this way for a long time, when one day Miss Havisham stopped short as she and I were walking, and leaning on my shoulder, she said with some displeasure, "You are growing tall, Pip." I thought it best to hint through the medium of a meditative look that this might be occasioned by circumstances over which I had no control. She said no more about it at the time, but she presently stopped and looked at me again, and presently again, and after that looked frowning and moody. On the next day of my attendance, when our usual exercise was over and I had landed her at her dressing table, she stayed me with a moment of her impatient fingers. "Tell me again of that blacksmith of yours." "Joe Gargery, ma'am." "Meaning the master you are to be apprenticed to?" "Yes, Miss Havisham." "You had better be apprenticed at once. Joe Gargery will come here with you and bring your indentures. Do you think he'd do that?" I signified that I had no doubt that he would take it as a great honour to be asked. "Then let him come." "At any particular time, Miss Havisham?" There, I know nothing about times." "Let him come soon, and come along with you." When I got home that night and delivered this message for Joe, My sister went on the rampage in a more alarming degree than at any previous period. She asked me and Joe whether we were supposed to be doormats under our feet, and how we dared to use her so, and what company we graciously thought she was fit for, when she had exhausted a torrent of such injuries. She threw a candlestick at Joe, burst out into loud sobbing, got out the dustpan, which was always a very bad sign, put on her coarse apron, and began cleaning up to a terrible extent. Not satisfied with dry cleaning, she took a pail and a scrubbing brush and cleaned us out of house and home, so that we stood shivering in the backyard. It was 10 o'clock at night before we would venture to creep in again, and then she asked Joe why he hadn't married a negress slave at once. Joe offered no answer to poor fellow, but stood feeling his whisker and looking dejectedly at me, as if he thought it really might have been a better speculation.